The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a fine, persistent mist that clung to the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor, blurring the edges of the world into a watercolor of gray and green. From her small window in the attic, Ilara could see the gardens dissolving into the fog, their late autumn roses drooping like bowed heads, heavy with water and sorrow. The house itself seemed to sigh with the weather, its timbers creaking, its long corridors filled with the sound of weeping glass. She had been at Blackwood for 3 weeks, and in that time, the son had felt like a distant rumor. Brought here as a poor and distant relation, her purpose was nebulous, a whisper of a role defined as companion to the Dowager Duchess. In truth, she was little more than a shadow, a useful pair of hands to thread needles for aging eyes, to read aloud from dry histories when the Duchess's own voice grew tired, and to be perpetually, quietly, present but unseen. She was a piece of furniture that breathed. Her days were measured in the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall, a solemn, judgmental sound that seemed to count not the hours, but her obligations. She ate her meals in silence, unless the Dowager felt inclined to speak. She walked the chilly halls with her shoulders hunched against a cold that was more than just the damp stone. It was the cold of invisibility, the chill of being utterly peripheral to the lives unfolding around her. She was a footnote in a story that was not her own, and she was acutely, painfully aware of it. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Beatrice, was not an unkind woman, but she was a woman encased in the amber of her own grief and station. Her world had shrunk to the confines of her sitting room, a space cluttered with memories and mementos of a life lived largely and loudly, now muted by age and loss. Her son, the Duke, was an even more remote figure, a ghost who haunted the London townhouses and foreign capitals of newspaper gossip, but who had not set foot in his ancestral home for 2 years, not since his young wife had been taken by a swift and sudden fever. Blackwood Manor was a house in mourning, not only for its lost duchess, but for its absent master. It ran on the inertia of old routines, managed by a skeleton staff who moved with the hushed reverence of curators in a museum. And into this silent, waiting world, Ilara had been placed, another quiet object to gather dust. Yet, within her, beneath the placid and unassuming surface she presented to the world, there was a core of unyielding order. She could not abide chaos, and Blackwood, for all its rigid social structure, was descending into a quiet, genteel chaos of its own. It began in the library. The Dowager had sent her to fetch a volume of poetry, and Ilara had found the room in a state of profound neglect. Books lay in precarious stacks on the floor, their spines cracking. A fine layer of dust covered every surface, turning the rich mahogany to a dull, listless brown. But it was the desk, the great ducal desk, that drew her eye. It was a maelstrom of paper, bills, receipts, letters from tenants, and, most alarmingly, massive, leather-bound ledgers thrown open and spilling their contents in an avalanche of numbers and ink. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed as a dangerous indulgence, won out. She drifted closer, her fingers tracing the faded gold leaf on the spine of one of the ledgers. She opened it. It was a record of the estate's accounts, but it was a mess, a battlefield of mismatched columns, frantic corrections, and entries that seemed to trail off into nothing. A deep, instinctual part of her, the part that craved logic and balance, recoiled. Her father, a humble country solicitor, had taught her the elegant language of numbers, the simple truth that could be found in a well-kept book. This was not a language, it was a scream. Without conscious thought, she began to work. She found a clean sheet of foolscap and a sharpened pencil. She started with the most recent entries, her brow furrowed in concentration. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the tall, arched windows, a sound that faded into the background as she was drawn deeper into the world of tenant rents, crop yields, and expenditures for roof repairs and seed grain. She forgot the time. She forgot her own insignificance. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose. The numbers made sense. They had rules. They did not judge or dismiss. They simply were. The light in the library was fading, turning the room into a cavern of shadows, when a sound from the doorway broke her concentration. A man stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he carried the damp chill of the outside world with him. He did not move for a long moment, simply watched her, his presence a sudden, heavy weight in the quiet room. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. She shot to her feet, scattering a few loose papers to the floor. She had been so engrossed, she had not even heard the approach of a carriage, the opening of doors, the arrival of the one person who had the right to be in this room, at this desk. The Duke of Blackwood had come home. He stepped into the room, and the shadows clung to him. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, his eyes the color of the winter sky. He looked from the chaotic desk to her, and then to the neat column of figures she had begun on her sheet of foolscap. A muscle worked in his jaw. His voice, when it came, was low and laced with ice. "Who are you, and what do you think you are doing?" The question was not an inquiry, it was an accusation. Ilara's mind went blank. All the composure she prided herself on evaporated under that cold, dismissive gaze. She was an intruder, a trespasser. I am Ilara, a guest of the Dowager Duchess." Her own voice sounded thin and reedy in the cavernous space. His eyes swept over her plain gray dress, taking in her status in a single humiliating glance. A guest. The word hung in the air, a euphemism for charity case. "A guest," he repeated, the words clipped. "And my mother's guests now feel at liberty to meddle in my private papers?" "No, Your Grace. I apologize. The ledgers, they were in disarray. I was merely—" She trailed off, realizing how presumptuous it sounded. "I was merely restoring order to your life." The words died on her tongue. He took another step into the room, his gaze falling on the ledger she had been working from. He did not look at her again. He looked at the book, at the papers, at the intrusion. "I do not care what state they were in. You will gather your things, and you will leave this room. And you will not return." He gestured dismissively toward the door, a flick of his wrist that felt like a slap. This is not a space for idle companions to amuse themselves. The injustice of it stung more than the insult. Idle. She had not been idle a single day of her life. She had worked harder in the last few hours, for no pay and for no thanks, than anyone in this house could imagine. But she did not say this. The habit of self-effacement was too strong. She simply bent, her cheeks burning with shame, and collected the few personal items she had brought with her. A small notebook, a handkerchief. She did not dare touch the foolscap with her neat figures. It belonged to him now, part of the mess he guarded so jealously. She walked towards the door, her head bowed. She did not look at him as she passed, but she could feel his eyes on her, a palpable weight of disapproval. The click of the library door latch behind her was the sound of a final judgment. He had dismissed her as completely and as casually as one might shoo away a stray cat. And in the cold, echoing silence of the hall, Ilara felt a familiar, bitter resignation settle over her. She was, as she had always been, entirely inconsequential. News of the Duke's return spread through the house like a cold draft. The staff moved with a new, nervous energy. The silence of the halls was now charged with expectation, with the fear of disturbing a master known for his dark moods and reclusive habits. Ilara retreated to her attic room, the scene in the library replaying in her mind, each cold word, each dismissive gesture, a fresh wound. The next morning, she was summoned to the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room. Lady Beatrice was seated by the fire, her embroidery lying untouched in her lap. Her eyes, usually softened by age, were sharp and discerning. "My son has returned," she stated, her voice neutral. Ilara murmured her assent, her gaze fixed on the pattern of the carpet. She expected a reprimand, a lecture on staying in her place, a reinforcement of the Duke's cold dismissal. Instead, the Duchess tilted her head. "He informed me that he found you in the library last evening. In his telling, you were disarranging his papers." There was a subtle questioning in her tone, a space left for Ilara to fill. For a moment, Ilara considered letting the lie stand. It was easier, it was safer. But something within her, the same instinct for order that had drawn her to the ledgers, rebelled. Forgive me, Your Grace, but that is not entirely accurate. I was attempting to organize them. The estate accounts are in a state of considerable confusion." The Duchess's eyebrows rose. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it felt like a seismic shift. "You understand accounts, child. My father was a solicitor. He believed a woman's education should be practical. I learned to keep his books from a young age." It was the most she had ever revealed about herself. Lady Beatrice was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. She seemed to be weighing something. The fire crackled, a warm and living sound in the tense quiet. Finally, she looked directly at Alara, her decision made. "My son, Alistair, has a great many fine qualities. A discerning eye for art, a brilliant mind for politics. But he has no head for numbers. And since his father's passing, and other events, he has allowed things to drift. His cousin, Lord Frederick, manages the finances from London. He sends reports. Alistair signs them. I suspect no one has truly looked at the books in years." She picked up a small ornate key from the mantelpiece. "There is a small office, behind the butler's pantry. It was my late husband's estate office. It has not been used in a decade. It is dusty and forgotten, and therefore it is the one place in this house my son is unlikely to ever set foot." She held the key out to Alara. "You said the accounts are in confusion. Show me." It was not a request. It was a command. But it was a command that felt like a lifeline. It was an invitation, not just into a dusty room, but into a world of purpose. Alara took the key, its cold metal, a solid, reassuring weight in her palm. The Duke had dismissed her from the library, the heart of the house. His mother, however, was inviting her into its hidden machinery. The estate office was exactly as the Duchess had described, small, dusty, and smelling of old paper and leather. A single, grimy window looked out onto a brick wall. But to Alara, it was a sanctuary. Over the next few days, with the Dowager's quiet blessing, the great, unwieldy ledgers were moved from the library to this small, forgotten room. Here, away from the judgmental eyes of the Duke and the solemn grandeur of the main house, Alara went to work. She cleaned the room herself, wiping down the shelves, scrubbing the small desk, and polishing the window until a sliver of watery sunlight could pierce the gloom. She worked with a quiet, fierce dedication. The chaos of the ledgers was a puzzle, and with each entry she corrected, each column she balanced, a piece of her own fractured sense of self seemed to click back into place. Here, in this room, she was not the poor relation, the invisible companion. She was competent. She was necessary. The Dowager Duchess would visit once a day, sitting in the single, stiff-backed chair, while Alara explained her findings. She spoke of discrepancies, of unpaid rents from tenants she knew to be honest, of bills from London merchants for goods that never seemed to appear at Blackwood. Lady Beatrice listened, her expression unreadable, asking sharp, intelligent questions that revealed a deep, albeit neglected, understanding of the estate she had once helped her husband run. A quiet alliance formed between the two women, a bond forged in ink and numbers, a silent conspiracy of competence. Alara saw nothing of the Duke. She took her meals in her room, and she timed her movements through the corridors to moments when she knew he was occupied. She lived in the margins, in the quiet spaces he did not inhabit. The estate office was her world, and she was content for it to remain so. One evening, nearly a fortnight after she had begun her work, she was bent over a particularly difficult ledger, a candle casting a warm pool of light on the page. The rest of the room was in shadow. The house was silent. The staff retired for the night. The only sound was the scratching of her pen and the sigh of the wind outside. A faint noise in the hallway, a soft footfall, made her pause. She held her breath, listening. The door creaked open. Duke Alistair stood on the threshold, his expression impossible to read in the flickering light. He did not look angry, merely watchful. He had sought her out. He had come to her space. "My mother tells me you have taken an interest in the household accounts," he said. His voice was different here, in this small, enclosed room, less like a command, more like a simple statement of fact. Alara's hand tightened on her pen. Her Grace asked me to look at them, yes. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The small room suddenly felt much smaller. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, his eyes scanning the neat stacks of paper, the tidy rows of ledgers, the clean, ordered space she had created from chaos. It was a stark contrast to the disarray he had found her in before. He stopped beside the desk, his gaze falling on the page she was working on. He was so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of rain and wool from his coat. "And what have you found?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She hesitated, then decided on the simple truth. "I have found that the estate is owed a great deal of money from its tenants, but the collection has been inconsistent. I have also found that the estate is paying a great deal of money for services and goods that I can find no record of ever receiving." He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the numbers. He was not dismissing her. He was listening. "Show me," he said, the two words a quiet echo of his mother's command. And so, by the light of a single candle, Alara began to explain. She pointed to entries, her finger tracing the lines of ink. She spoke of phantom shipments of feed, of invoices for repairs to roofs that she knew for a fact were still leaking. She spoke not with accusation, but with the simple, irrefutable logic of mathematics. He listened, his expression intent. He asked questions, sharp and to the point. He was no longer the cold, aloof duke, but a landowner confronted with the reality of his own neglect. As she was explaining a particularly convoluted entry, she pointed with her pen to a figure in the debit column. At the same moment he reached out, his own finger moving to trace the corresponding entry on the credit side. Their hands met over the open ledger. It was not a brush, but a definite, solid contact. His fingers were long and cool, and they rested against hers for a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, went through her. It was as if the candle flame had leaped from the wick and touched her skin. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up and found him already looking at her, his dark eyes no longer cold, but filled with a strange, unreadable light. The air in the small room crackled with a new tension, something that had nothing to do with numbers or ledgers. It was the silent, sudden recognition of another soul in the room. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched, filled with the unspoken. He finally broke the silence, his voice rougher than before. "It is late. You should get some rest." He straightened up, moving away from the desk, putting a careful distance between them. But the space was still charged with the memory of that brief, unintentional touch. He paused at the door. "Continue your work," he said, and then he was gone. Alara sat frozen in her chair for a long time after he left, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Duke had come to her. He had listened. He had, for a moment, seen her. The candle flame dipped and danced, casting long shadows on the wall, but the room no longer felt like a sanctuary from the world. The world, in the form of its brooding, complicated Duke, had just walked in. Alistair retreated to the library, the room he had banished her from, but it offered no comfort. The scent of old leather and paper was now mingled with a faint, phantom scent of lemon soap and earnest diligence that he associated with her. He poured himself a brandy, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. It was not the chill of grief, the familiar companion of the last 2 years. It was something new, something unsettling. He had gone to the estate office intending to put a stop to it. His mother's meddling was one thing, but allowing this quiet, observant little mouse to dig through the foundations of his family's finances felt like a violation. He had been prepared to be angry, to be imperious, to shut it all down. But he had opened the door and seen her there, illuminated by the candlelight, a small island of order in the vast, dark sea of the house. She had not looked frightened or guilty. She had looked serene. And when she had spoken, her voice calm and clear, laying out the stark facts of his own neglect, he had felt not anger, but a slow, dawning shame. The touch of her hand had been an accident, a random collision of atoms in a small, crowded space, but it had felt like anything but. It had felt like an anchor. For 2 years he had been drifting, a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of a love that had been vibrant and full of laughter, now silenced. He had closed himself off, believing that to feel anything new would be a betrayal of what he had lost. His grief was a fortress, and he was its solitary prisoner. But this woman, this Alara, had not tried to breach the walls. She had simply shown up and started quietly tending the overgrown gardens of his estate, both literal and metaphorical. She did not flatter or cajole. She simply pointed to a leaky roof and said, "This needs fixing." And in that simple, practical statement, there was a truth he had been avoiding for years. Things were broken, and they would not fix themselves. The arrival of Lord Frederick a week later felt like a cold, bracing slap of reality. Frederick was Alistair's first cousin, a man whose life was a testament to the triumph of charm over substance. He arrived in a flurry of fashionable luggage and loud greetings, filling the quiet halls of Blackwood with the scent of expensive cologne and the sound of his own booming voice. "Alistair, my dear fellow," he exclaimed, clapping the Duke on the shoulder. "Brooding in the country again, are we? You'll turn into one of your own gargoyles if you're not careful." Alistair endured the greeting with his customary stoicism. He had long found his cousin's effusive nature tiresome, but Frederick was family, and he was, ostensibly, the man keeping the entire financial apparatus of the dukedom from collapsing. Frederick's sharp eyes, however, missed nothing. He quickly noted the subtle changes in the house, the new energy, the quiet purpose. And his gaze soon fell upon Alara. He first saw her in the company of the Dowager Duchess, and he dismissed her with the casual indifference of a man accustomed to categorizing women by their dowries and connections. But then he began to hear whispers. A new efficiency in the kitchens. A more organized system for distributing alms. And then the true source of his alarm. He learned that the old estate office was in use again. He made it his business to discover by whom. Section. He found her there one afternoon, a sliver of sunlight from the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around her head. He did not knock. He simply entered, a charming, predatory smile fixed on his face. "Well, well, what have we here? The mysterious little scribbler I've been hearing about." Alara looked up, startled. She had heard of Lord Frederick, of course. His was the name that appeared again and again in the ledgers, attached to large, unexplained expenditures. Seeing him in the flesh was like seeing a villain from a book step off the page. He was handsome, in a polished, superficial way, but his eyes were cold and assessing. "I am Miss Alara, my lord. I am assisting the Dowager Duchess." She kept her voice even, her gaze steady. "Assisting, are you?" He sauntered into the room, picking up one of the ledgers and flipping through it with a dismissive air. "It looks more like you're playing at being a clerk. A rather dreary occupation for a young lady. You should be practicing your watercolors, not wrestling with sums you couldn't possibly understand." The condescension was a palpable thing. "The sums are quite straightforward, my lord," she replied, her voice cool. His smile tightened. He had expected a flustered, deferential girl. He had not expected this quiet, unshakable composure. He saw her not as a person, but as a threat to his comfortable, lucrative arrangement. He decided then and there that she had to be removed. His campaign was one of subtle sabotage. He would accidentally spill a cup of tea on a freshly balanced page of accounts. He would contradict her findings in front of the Duke, using his easy charm to cast doubt on her meticulous work. "My dear cousin," he would say with a laugh, "you can't possibly be taking the scribblings of a provincial girl over my years of experience. She simply doesn't understand the complexities of our finances." Alistair, to Alara's deep disappointment, said nothing. He would listen to Frederick's smooth explanations, and then to her quiet, fact-based rebuttals, his face an unreadable mask. He never took sides. He simply observed, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. Alara began to feel as though she were in a contest she could not win, her simple truths no match for Frederick's practiced lies. The public humiliation, when it came, was as swift and brutal as an execution. Alistair, at his mother's insistence, had agreed to host a small dinner for a few of the neighboring landowners. It was the first time he had entertained since his wife's death, and the atmosphere in the dining room was tense. The candlelight glittered on the silver and crystal, but it could not dispel the gloom. Alara was seated at the far end of the table, a silent, gray moth among butterflies. She had hoped to be invisible. Frederick, however, had other plans. In a lull in the conversation, he turned his charming smile upon her, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Miss Alara, I was just reviewing the accounts for the winter provisions. I see you authorized a rather generous distribution of blankets and coal to the tenants in the West Village, an entire wagon's worth." All eyes turned to her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "The cottages are old, my lord. The winter is expected to be harsh. I felt it was a prudent investment in the health of the Duke's people." Frederick let out a short, pitying laugh. "An investment," he boomed, playing to the room. "My dear girl, you speak of it as if it were your own pin money you were spending. It is the Duke's money, and while your tender-hearted charity is admirable in a woman, it is financial suicide for an estate. We are not a benevolent society." He turned to the other guests, his expression one of amused exasperation. "You see the trouble we have? We allow the little bookkeeper to get a taste of authority, and suddenly she thinks she is Lady Bountiful." The table chuckled. The words, "the little bookkeeper," hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated insult designed to strip her of her dignity and put her firmly back in her place. She looked down the long, polished table to where Alistair sat at its head. She searched his face for some sign of support, some flicker of defense. There was nothing. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the glass of wine in front of him. His silence was a roar. It was a public confirmation of her insignificance. It told everyone in the room that what Frederick said was true. She was nobody, her opinion worthless, her humiliation a matter of complete indifference to him. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, cold blade twisting in her chest. It was worse than Frederick's sneering words. It was the ultimate dismissal. She held her head high, her back straight, her expression carefully neutral. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears, but inside, something vital and hopeful withered and died. She endured the rest of the dinner in a haze of misery, the food tasteless, the conversation a meaningless buzz. As soon as was polite, she excused herself, fleeing to the one place she had once considered a sanctuary, the small estate office. But it was a sanctuary no longer. The ledgers on the desk seemed to mock her, a testament to her foolishness. She had believed this work gave her value, but she was wrong. In this world, value was determined by birth and title, and she had neither. A deep, cold fury began to burn through her despair. They thought she was a fool. They thought she was a sentimental girl who didn't understand the way of the world. She would show them. She would not run. She would not hide. She would finish what she started. She lit a candle and pulled out the ledgers, not the current ones, but the old ones, the ones from the past 2 years, the ones that covered the period of Frederick's uncontested stewardship. Her work until now had been about correcting the present. Now, she would excavate the past. She would follow every penny, every transaction, every whisper of a lie. If she was going to be cast out, she would leave knowing the full and complete truth. She worked through the night, fueled by coffee and a righteous anger. The house slept. The rain began to fall again, a soft, whispering sound against the window pane. And in the quiet hours before dawn, she found it. It was not one thing, but 100 small things. A pattern, subtle and insidious. Payments to a shipping company that did not exist. Invoices for building materials from a supplier who was Frederick's own silent partner in a London venture. Rents collected from tenants but never recorded in the income column. It was not mismanagement. It was not extravagance. It was theft. Cold, calculated, and systematic. Frederick was not just a charming rogue. He was a vulture, picking the bones of the estate clean while its master was lost in grief. The scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. As the first gray light of dawn seeped into the room, Alara sat back in her chair, the evidence spread out before her. She was exhausted, but her mind was clear. She now held a truth that could destroy a nobleman and shatter the fragile peace of this house. And she had a choice to make. She could take it to the Duke, but how could she? He had sat in silence while she was humiliated. He had allowed his cousin to mock and belittle her. How could she trust him to act on this, to choose her word, the word of the little bookkeeper, over that of his own blood? The risk was too great. If he sided with Frederick, she would not just be dismissed, she would be ruined, accused of slander, her name blackened forever. There was only one other person in this house who had shown her any measure of trust, who had looked at her and seen competence instead of insignificance. With trembling hands, she gathered the most damning of the papers, folded them neatly, and walked through the silent, sleeping house to the Dowager Duchess's chambers. She knocked softly on the door. Lady Beatrice was an early riser. She opened the door herself, already dressed, her expression one of concern when she saw Alara's pale, exhausted face. "Child, what is it?" "Your Grace," Alara said, her voice low and urgent. "I must speak with you. I have found something terrible." In the Dowager's private sitting room, with the morning sun casting long shadows, Alara laid out the proof of Frederick's treachery. She did not embellish, she did not accuse, she simply presented the facts, the numbers, the cold, hard evidence she had painstakingly unearthed. The Duchess listened without interruption, her face growing grimmer with each page Alara revealed. The charming, lazy nephew she had tolerated for years was a thief, a parasite who had been draining the lifeblood from her family's legacy. When Alara was finished, the silence in the room was profound. "You have done well, Alara," the Duchess said finally, her voice steely. "You have shown a courage and an integrity that puts many in this house to shame, including, I fear, my own son." She stood, her back ramrod straight. "He has been blind for too long. It is time he was made to see." She took the papers from Alara. "Leave this with me now. Go and get some rest. You have earned it." Alistair was in the stables, trying to lose himself in the familiar comforting routine of grooming his horse, when his mother found him. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She held out the sheaf of papers. "You will come with me to the library, Alistair, and you will read these, and for the first time in 2 years, you will act like the Duke you are supposed to be." The command in her voice was one he had not heard since he was a boy. He followed her in silence, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. In the library, the site of his first, cold encounter with Alara, his mother closed the door and laid the papers on the great desk. "This is the work of your little bookkeeper," she said, the words sharp with irony. "The girl you allowed your cousin to humiliate last night. She stayed up all night, not weeping over the insult, but working to protect this family from a traitor in its midst. A traitor you have been too blind, too lost in your own sorrow to see." He began to read. At first he was skeptical, but the evidence was overwhelming, the logic irrefutable. The neat, precise handwriting he recognized from the estate office laid out a story of betrayal so profound it took his breath away. Frederick, his own flesh and blood, had been robbing him blind, preying on his grief and neglect. But the shame he felt over his cousin's actions was nothing compared to the wave of self-loathing that washed over him as he thought of the scene at the dinner table. He had sat there, mute, while the one person who was fighting for him, for his legacy, for his people, was torn down. Why? He had told himself it was because he did not want to cause a scene. He had told himself it was because he was above such petty squabbles. But the truth, the ugly, searing truth, was that he had been afraid. He had heard the venom in Frederick's voice, and had felt a surge of rage so cold and so absolute that he had feared what he might do if he spoke. He had feared losing the last vestiges of his tightly held control. And so, to protect himself from his own anger, he had sacrificed her. He had let the world see his silence as agreement, his stillness as indifference. He looked up from the papers, his face pale. "I have been a fool," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Worse," his mother said, her voice softening slightly. "You have been a coward. Not in the face of your enemies, but in the face of your own heart. You have let your grief become an excuse for abdication. This girl, this Alara, has more honor and courage in her little finger than Frederick has in his entire body. She brought this to me, not you, because you gave her no reason to trust you. You let her believe you thought her worthless. Every word was a nail in the coffin of his self-respect. He had inherited a dukedom, a legacy built by generations of strong, decisive men, and he had let it rot, both literally and figuratively, while he nursed his own private pain. He had believed that his loyalty to his late wife's memory required him to shut out the world. He saw now that it was a selfish, indulgent lie. True loyalty was in upholding the duties and responsibilities he had been born to, the ones his wife had so joyfully shared with him. "What do you intend to do?" his mother asked, her eyes searching his. A new resolve hardened his face, replacing the grief-stricken apathy with a cold, clear purpose. "I intend to set my house in order," he said. He sent a footman to summon Lord Frederick to the library in 1 hour. He sent another to find Miss Alara and ask her to attend as well. He needed her there, not as a witness, but as a participant. Justice demanded her presence. Frederick arrived first, strolling into the library with an air of supreme confidence. He saw the grim look on Alistair's face and assumed the summons was about to finally dismiss the troublesome bookkeeper. "About time, old boy," he said, helping himself to the decanter of brandy. "I told you she was a menace, stirring up trouble where there is none." Alistair watched him, his expression chillingly calm. "On the contrary, Frederick, it seems she has not stirred up nearly enough." The door opened, and Alara stepped inside. She looked pale but composed, her eyes wary. She looked at the Duke, then at Lord Frederick, a silent player in a drama she did not yet understand. "Ah, the guest of honor," Frederick sneered. "Come to receive your walking papers, have you, my dear?" Alistair moved to stand beside Alara. It was a small movement, but it was a definitive statement. He was no longer at the head of the table, distant and removed. He was by her side. He placed the damning papers on the desk in front of Frederick. "You will look at these," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth, "and then you will explain them." Frederick's jovial mask slipped. He glanced at the papers, his face losing its color. He saw the collated evidence, the neat summaries in Alara's hand, the undeniable proof of his crimes. He looked from the papers to Alara, his eyes filled with a new, venomous hatred. "She has poisoned you against me. This little nobody, this charity case, has filled your head with lies." "They are not lies," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They are numbers. And they tell a very simple story. They tell a story of a man who preyed on his family, who stole from the tenants who depend on us, who betrayed every trust placed in him. They tell the story of a common thief." "You would take her word over mine?" Frederick sputtered, his face now a blotchy red. "Your own blood?" Alistair's gaze was like ice. "She is not my blood, but she has shown more loyalty, more integrity, and more honor than you could ever comprehend. She has worked to save this estate, while you have worked to gut it. She has protected my people, while you have robbed them. Her worth is not in her name or her station. It is here." He tapped the papers. "It is in her character, something you clearly lack." The public defense was absolute. The validation was complete. In front of the man who had humiliated her, the Duke had not only defended her, but he had elevated her, championing her inner worth over the empty claim of bloodlines. Frederick, defeated and exposed, seemed to shrink. The charm was gone, leaving only a sour, pathetic man. "What are you going to do?" he whispered. "You will pack your bags, you will be escorted from Blackwood, and you will never return. I will not have you prosecuted, not for my sake, but for the sake of the family name you have so thoroughly disgraced. I am giving you enough money to secure passage to America. If I ever hear of you setting foot in England again, I will see you in prison." Alistair's voice was final. He turned his back on his cousin, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Frederick scrambled from the room, his flight as undignified as his crimes. The library was silent again, the air thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. Alara stood, her heart pounding. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed. She had been vindicated, but she felt no triumph, only a profound sense of exhaustion. Alistair turned to her. The cold fury had left his face, replaced by an expression of deep, weary regret. "Miss Elara, can you forgive me?" "Forgive you, Your Grace?" she asked, confused. "There is nothing to forgive. You have done—" "No," he interrupted, his voice raw. "I have done far too late what I should have done from the beginning. I sat in silence while you were insulted. I allowed you to believe that I agreed with that creature. My silence was not indifference. It was cowardice. And for that, I am truly and deeply sorry. I failed you." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the Duke, but the man. A man humbled, a man wrestling with his own demons. "You did not fail me, Your Grace," she said softly. "You just had not found your voice yet." A sad smile touched his lips. "You found it for me. You, with your courage and your quiet integrity. You came into this dark, silent house, and you started turning on the lights, one by one." He took a step closer. "I have been living in a tomb of my own making, Elara. You have shown me that the door is not locked." Later that evening, after the last tremor of Frederick's departure had faded from the house, Alistair found her in the estate office. She was not working. She was standing by the small window, looking out at the darkness. "I came to thank you," he said from the doorway. She turned. "It was my duty, Your Grace." "No," he said, stepping into the room. "It was your choice. And it was a brave one." He walked to the desk, their desk, and rested his hands on the worn wood. "This room. This is where the real work of Blackwood is done. I have neglected it for too long." He looked at her, his eyes serious and direct. "The estate needs a great deal of work to recover from Frederick's management. It needs a guiding hand, a clear eye, a compassionate heart." He paused. "It needs you, Elara, not as a bookkeeper, not as a companion. I have spent the last 2 years honoring a memory. It is time I started honoring the living." He took a breath, the words coming slowly, carefully, as if he were treading on sacred ground. "I am not an easy man. I am melancholic, and I am accustomed to solitude. But I find that my solitude is no longer peaceful. It is merely empty. You have filled the silence in this house with purpose. I find I am not ready for that purpose to leave." He was not offering her a title. He was not speaking of jewels or status. He was speaking of partnership. He was speaking of need, his need. "Elara," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I am asking you to stay, to help me rebuild, to be my partner in all things. I am asking you to be my wife." The question hung in the quiet air of the small, dusty room. It was the most unexpected, most earth-shattering question she had ever heard. He was the Duke, she was the nobody. The world would be scandalized. But in his eyes, she saw none of that. She saw a man who was not offering her his title, but himself. A flawed, wounded, but honorable man who had finally found his way out of the darkness. He was not asking for a duchess. He was asking for her, for Elara. She thought of the cold dismissal in the library and the years of being overlooked that had come before it. And she thought of the quiet alliance with his mother, the satisfying logic of the ledgers, the startling warmth of his hand on hers. She thought of his silence at the dinner table, and his powerful, redeeming voice in the aftermath. It had all led to this moment. "Alistair," she said, testing his name on her tongue for the first time. It felt right. "My answer is yes." A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features, chasing away the last of the shadows. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hands in his. His hands were warm now and strong, and they held hers as if they were the most precious treasure in the world. 1 year later, the rain was falling again, but it was a different kind of rain, a soft spring shower that washed the world clean and left the air smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. In the gardens of Blackwood Manor, the roses were not drooping, but lifting their faces to the sky, their petals studded with diamonds of water. The gardens, like the estate, were flourishing under new management. In the library, The great ducal desk was no longer a maelstrom of chaos. Two people sat there, side by side, their heads bent over a large, open ledger. A vase of fresh-cut flowers stood on the corner of the desk, a splash of vibrant color in the book-lined room. "The new drainage system in the North Fields is complete," Alara said, tracing a line with her finger. "The tenants report the land is already much improved." "And the cost?" Alistair asked, his voice laced with a teasing warmth. "Under budget," she replied, a small, proud smile playing on her lips. "The contractor we chose was honest and efficient." He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of affection and shared contentment. "Of course he was. My wife has an unerring eye for honesty." The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the quiet, bustling sounds of a well-run home, of a place that was loved and cared for. The Dowager Duchess, her eyes bright with a joy she had thought lost forever, now presided over lively, informal dinners where laughter was not only permitted, but encouraged. The ghost of the sad, lost Duchess had been gently laid to rest, honored not by perpetual mourning, but by the continuation of life and love within her home. Later, as dusk settled over the green hills, Alistair and Alara walked through the gardens, their arms linked. The air was cool, but she felt nothing but warmth. They stopped by the old stone gatehouse at the edge of the estate. "This is where I first saw you," Alistair said quietly, looking not at the gatehouse, but at her face, his expression full of a tender wonder that still made her heart ache. "You were walking up to the main house, your back so straight, looking so small and so determined in this great, imposing place." She smiled. "I was terrified." "You never showed it," he said. "You have a strength in you, Alara, that could move mountains. You just do it so quietly. No one realizes the mountain has been moved until they see the sun shining on the other side." It was true that the world saw a fairy tale, the story of the penniless relation who had captured the heart of the brooding, wealthy duke. But they knew the truth was something quieter, deeper, and far more profound. It was not a story of capture, but of recognition. He had not rescued her. He had seen her. And in being truly seen, she had found the freedom to be herself, and in seeing her, he had found his way back to himself. The Duke had dismissed a bookkeeper from a room, a cold gesture born of grief and blindness, but a man had fallen in love with the woman who put his world back in order. Her worth had never been in question, only in shadow. He had simply been the man fortunate enough to be there when she and his mother finally decided to let the light in, inviting her not just through the front door, but into the very heart of the house, and his own.